All right, hello everybody. Today marks our second installment on the morality of abortion. Today is also our pro-choice day, so we're going to be looking at um, Judith Jarvis Thompson's essay, "A Defense of Abortion," and we're going to be looking at arguments that suggest that abortion is morally permissible. Okay, so recall from last time that we chatted about personhood, whether or not personhood is a central feature that we have to have for the abortion debate, right? So typically, the abortion debate is framed around uh, is the fetus a person? If it is a person, then it's morally wrong to have an abortion. If it's not a person, then it's morally okay to have an abortion. And so that's been the central focus of the debate. But Don Marcus illustrated that even if the fetus is not a person, it still can be wrong to have an abortion. And we're going to see that Judith Jarvis Thompson says that even if the fetus is a person, it can still be morally okay to have an abortion. So I like these two papers because they move the debate to other areas outside of just whether or not the fetus is a person. That's so if you're a pro-life person and you demonstrate that the fetus is a person, you're not out of the woods yet. If you're a pro-choice person and you demonstrate that the fetus is not a person, you're still not out of the woods, right? And so these two papers go really well together because they kind of like reframe the whole discussion. Okay, so we're going to be looking at A Defense of Abortion by Judith Jarvis Thompson. And she's going to be so the primary method of argument here is by way of analogy. Um, this is not the best way to argue for a point, but the idea here is that she presents several analogies, right, that are meant to poke at our moral intuitions and that are meant to be analogous enough to abortion to where if we say that it's morally okay in one case, we also have to say that it's morally okay in the latter case, in that is in the abortion case. So such that if you accept that it's morally permissible to kill the violinist or to kill the seed, then that means you're also okay with having an abortion as well, because there are enough similar features that they overlap, right? If we have moral intuitions in the one case, we should also have moral intuitions in the other case. That's the central sort of like mechanism of argument in this paper. Okay, so we talked about like personhood last time. We talked about the accrual view of accrual of view of personhood, which suggests that as you gain more capacities, you gain more moral status, right? So this is like a very traditional way of thinking about ethics. And we're also going to look at authors who reject this view of ethics, right? Rather, the central feature should be whether or not something is alive, right? And this is called biocentrism. According to biocentrism, you have full moral status merely in virtue of being alive, where alive is understood as autopoietic functioning, right? So self maintenance. It's that feature that makes something morally considerable. So according to the Roe and Casey precedents, viability is a central feature for whether or not abortion can be legal. The idea here is that after the first trimester, more often than not, the fetus is viable, such that it could live independently of the womb. And according to the law, that's an important feature to have. Granted, it's somewhat arbitrary. It's not like a great way of defining when something has a legal status. And that's because we're all dependent in some ways. And so it feels a little bit arbitrary. But it's what the law has suggested is the morally relevant trait or the legally relevant trait. And that's kind of what we have to work with. So before viability is concerned, It's legally in most presidents or in most precincts, it's permissible to have an abortion. Okay, so um, Judith Jarvis Thompson is going to be arguing from a moral perspective. She's going to be suggesting that it's okay to have an abortion, morally speaking, at any point in time in the pregnancy. So viability doesn't matter to her. Okay, so this is the kind of argument that Thompson is going to be objecting to. So, um, so this is something like a very traditional pro-life argument that suggests that an abortion is morally wrong. So it's just like all people or all persons have a right to life. The fetus is a person; it has a right to life, and the mother also has a right to decide what happens to her body. And so when a mother wants to have an abortion, her right to decide what happens to her body comes into conflict with the fetus's right to life. This is where she's going to be contributing to the discussion. We have a rights conflict such that the fetus's right to life overcomes the mother's right to choose what happens to her body, right? So right to life, right to body, right to life wins. That's the essential question here. Okay, so how's she going to do this? She's going to be talking about various analogies, right? Such that if you accept the moral permissibility in one analogy, you're also going to accept the moral permissibility of abortion as well. So, it for the violinist analogy, imagine that you're like one day you're like hit upside the head and you wake up and you are hooked up to a world famous violinist. The Music Lovers Society has, without your consent, kidnapped you, and they tell you that for 9 months you have to be hooked up to the violinist. And if you unhook yourself, the violinist is going to die. Apparently, you have the blood type that will save the violinist, and that's the you're the only person with the right kind of blood to save the violinist. So if you go, there's no other hope, right? So the question is, given that you did not consent to this situation, right? Is it morally okay for you to leave? Is it morally permissible for you to unhook yourself from the violinist? Judith Jarvis Thompson says that it is morally permissible for you to unhook yourself from the violinist, right? In fact, it feels like you don't have to just sit there and lay in bed for 9 months, right? Rather, you can you are free to make your choice. Given that you didn't consent to be hooked up to the violinist, you are free to unplug yourself and let the violinist die. And so the claim is that if you accept that it's morally permissible to let the violinist die, well, then it's okay to in cases of non-consensual sexual intercourse, that's rape. In rape cases where somebody's pregnant, that means that that person can have can morally permissibly have an abortion. So it's okay to have an abortion in rape cases. That's what the violinist analogy shows, or is proposed to show at least. So, for example, if you accept that it's okay to let the violinist die, it's also okay to let the fetus die. And it's important to note that the violinist is a person, right? That much is not up for argument here. Um, she wants to say that this is, a full-blooded person who's like normally would be doing lots of different things and who morally matters a whole lot, right? Um, so we can think about the fetus as having all of those features, and it still be morally okay to let a fetus die or to kill a fetus in cases of non-consensual sex. Okay, so Judith Jarvis Thompson makes an assumption. Uh, it's she wants to say that the right to life is negative, right? So okay, so what's a positive and negative right? A negative right means that I have to refrain from doing something to you. Okay, so for example, if the right to life is negative, uh, that means that I can't hit you in the face with a hammer and kill you, right? I can't murder you. I can't shoot you. I can't burn you, right? So that means I have to refrain from doing things to you. Okay, if the right to life is positive, that means that I have to do certain things to make your life longer, right? So, for example, if you're starving and you have a positive right to life, that means that I may have to give you food in order to save your life. Now, if the right to life is negative and you're starving, then I don't have to give you anything to save your life, right? I'm not obligated to save your life. I can merely walk away from you, and that's morally permissible if the right to life is negative, right? So, for example, if the right to life is positive, then it's not clear that it's morally permissible, even if it's against your consent, to detach yourself from the violinist, right? Because you may owe it to the violinist to give, like you may owe it to the violinist to let her use your body, right? Whereas if the right to life is negative, you don't owe it to the violinist to let her use your body. So it really seems like uh, Thompson is using, or it makes this assumption that the right to life is negative. So, for example, we're not going to read him in this class, but in a couple of papers, Peter Singer makes the case that we are morally obliged to save a drowning child, right? Even if we have to ruin a lot of our clothes to do so, right? Imagine I have to jump into a pond and save a drowning child. And that it's relatively easy. I'm a good swimmer. I'm like, say, I don't pose a risk to myself to do this, right? Not much of a risk, other than destroying my clothes. He wants to say that we're morally obligated to do so. And given that, he wants to say that we're morally obligated to give money for famine relief to save other people who are starving in the world. That's kind of the structure of the argument. But Singer would respond to Judith Jarvis Thompson, and he would say that the right to life is positive, right? He wants to say that you're obligated to save the kid. But if the right to life is negative, you can just walk away from the kid, and that's not a problem, given that uh, you don't owe it to the kid to do something to save him, right? So one central question in Thompson's argument is whether or not the right to life is positive or negative. Okay, so this is sort of a recap of Thompson's argument. The central question is um, whether or not it's unjust to kill the fetus. Okay, and so um, she wants to say that given that the right to life is negative, you don't owe it to the fetus to let it use your body, and so you can detach with the fetus at any point at any stage in the pregnancy, and it's not morally unjust because you never owed it to the fetus to let it use your body. But so far, we've only seen that she establishes this in cases of non consensual sex. So the violinist analogy only shows that it's morally impermissible to have an abortion in cases of rape. But she talks about other analogies to suggest that it's not morally permissible, or it is morally permissible to have an abortion at any stage, right? So, for example, she talks about the burglar analogy and the people seeds analogy. So I have a window. Check it out. It's a little overexposed at the moment. Um, so suppose that I open up this window, right? And a burglar comes in. This is like something that I'm really scared of, right? And suppose that the burglar comes in after I open up the window. Do I have, given that I opened up the window, does it mean that I have to let this guy into my house, right? So suppose that it's winter right now, but suppose that it's summertime and that my house gets kind of stuffy, right? It gets hot, and I'm like, man, I'm hot. What can I do to make it cooler in here? Bang! I open the window for a little bit of pleasure, right? A little bit of relief to make me to cool me off, and that gives me pleasure, right? So the reason that I open the window is for pleasure. Okay. And so somebody comes in, a burglar comes in. Do I have the right to kick that guy out? Strongly seems that I do, right? Okay, so by analogy, I have a little bit of sex for pleasure, right? Just like I open up the window for pleasure. Um, and somebody had sex for pleasure and they get pregnant, say. Given that they had sex merely for the reason of pleasure, does that mean that they owe it to the fetus to carry it to term, to let the fetus use their body for 9 months? The idea here is that if you accept that we ought to kick out the burglar, we should kick out the burglar, or that we're entitled to kick out the burglar, the idea is that you also have to accept that we can kick out the fetus, so to speak. We can have an abortion. So if you have sex for pleasure, it's still permissible to have an abortion. But you might be thinking, well, okay, so there's a difference between these two analogies. In one case, you're just kicking the burglar out of your house, right? It doesn't kill the burglar, right? Whereas in the other case, we kill the fetus, right? So given there's a disanalogy here. We're killing the fetus and we're just like kicking the burglar out. That seems like too different for us for our intuitions to connect. Okay, so in response to this concern, Thompson raises the people seeds analogy here. You see this fella, this person who is also like a plant. Really weird. So, people seeds. Let's suppose that we know that there are these things called people seeds. So they're these little tiny seeds. They kind of float around in the air, and then they land somewhere and they germinate and they grow into a plant that will just be a person that can just like walk around and like a little baby, like, right? Uh, uh, let's suppose that the seeds germinate and bang, you have a baby after like 9 months, right? So it grows and then it turns into a baby. Okay, let's say that I know that that there are these people seeds. Okay, and it's hot in my house like usual, and let's suppose that I open up the window for a little bit of pleasure. And even suppose that given that I know that there's a possibility that a people seed might get into my house, suppose that I have a screen over the window, right, to keep the seeds out. Okay, so suppose I open up the window and there's a little tiny hole in the screen. Okay, and one of the seeds falls through that hole and lands on the floor. And it starts to germinate in my carpet, right? You see the carpet there. And here's a question. Can I step on the seed? Can I kill the seed? Do I have to just let it sit there for 9 months and then raise the people seed baby that comes afterward? Right? Do I owe it to the people seed to let it use my house, let it use my floor, right? Judith Jarvis Thompson says, no, you can stomp on the people seed, right? And presumably we should have the intuition that we can also stomp on the people seed, right? Merely for like opening the window doesn't like give the people seed the right to just use our house, right? Okay. By analogy, it's morally permissible to have an abortion after having sex for pleasure, after a contraceptive failure, right? So you have sex for pleasure, there's a contraceptive problem, and someone gets pregnant. Thompson wants to say that that person can permissibly have an abortion. And she wants to say that if you accept that we like get rid of the people seed, we also can get rid of the fetus in the womb, right? And so given that the right to life is negative, even if we assume that they're both persons in the full sense, we can permissibly have um, an abortion. So let's see. So let's return briefly to our discussion of positive and negative rights. So let's suppose here, this is the Henry Fonda example. So Henry Fonda is like a great big movie superstar from like the 40s and 50s. Um, he would be equivalent to somebody like super duper famous today. Um, I don't know, Keanu Reeves comes to mind, but that's not quite right. Maybe like Brad Pitt. So let's suppose that Brad Pitt one day wakes up with super healing powers, right? Such that he can heal somebody merely by putting his hand on his forehead or by kissing them on the forehead, right? So kissing on the forehead may not work because of COVID right now, but maybe just putting your hand on somebody's head and that automatically heals that person. Thompson wants to say that if the right to life is positive, that means that Brad Pitt is going to be very, 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 very busy saving people's lives. He's not going to have time to eat. He's not going to have time to sleep. He's just going to have to save people all of the time, no matter what. He's morally obligated to do those things because he has the power to save somebody's life. He's going to have to be really busy saving everybody's life, right? Thompson wants to say that look, Henry Fonda, Brad Pitt, they're not obligated to save everybody, right? They can have some time by themselves. They can have some time alone, right? And it be totally morally permissible. And so she thinks that this case points to the conclusion that the right to life is negative. Okay. Okay, so Thompson's conclusion is that we reframe the whole debate um, in terms of uh, a conflict of rights. She wants to say, look, we should be talking about decency, right? And so moral decency gets into the language of virtue ethics, right? What is a morally decent person? Morally decent person is somebody who is has a morally upright character, right? Whereas a morally indecent person would be like a vicious person, be like an evil person, right? We'd say you're so indecent, right? Um, so she wants to say that the abortion debate or that the concept of decency can capture a lot of our intuitions about different cases. Um, so imagine that a 14-year-old girl has an abortion after a rape case. That doesn't feel very morally indecent, right? She seems to have a good character, the mother, that is. Um, Whereas somebody who has an abortion, say 8.5 weeks into their pregnancy in order to go on vacation, right? That seems wrong, right? Just feels wrong. So even though the mother it's well within her rights for the mother to have that abortion, it still feels morally indecent, right? She seems to be demonstrating a poor character trait in virtue of doing that, right? So something can be just, right? Morally speaking, morally just, in terms of consistent with all rights, but also morally indecent. Um, and so, in the similar way that something can be just and decent, something can be just and indecent as well. And so, for example, she uses the box of chocolates example. You have these kids. This kid gets a box of chocolates and isn't going to give his brother one of the chocolates. Granted, they're his chocolates, right? It's well within his rights, Thompson wants to say, to keep all the chocolates and eat all of them, right? He doesn't owe any of those chocolates to his brother, but we might say that he's like greedy, and we might say that he's being indecent in virtue of not sharing any of his chocolates. Um, he said, so even though we can have or a just action, it can still be morally indecent. So overall, she wants to conclude that we use the language of character and decency rather than rights conflicts in the abortion debate, right? So the decency can like kind of capture a lot of our intuitions about what or how we think about particular cases of abortion. Okay, thanks.